Hello and welcome to another edition of IMO Bastani with me, Aaron Bastani, at Aaron Bastani on Twitter. As ever, thank you so much for watching. Well, this week I want to talk about what Chancellor George Osborne touched on last week. He was speaking to a range of business leaders in Cardiff. He talked about a cocktail of threats that faced the UK economy in 2016, a daiquiri of disaster, a caipirinha of chaos, a mojito of mayhem. The middle one, a caipirinha, of course, made with cachaça. The first and third are made with rum. Don't ever forget that. Very important point. What was that cocktail composed of? Well, it's overwhelmingly from the developing world, the global south, whatever you want to call it. Of course, 60% of global GDP now is developing world economies. Problems in Brazil, scheduled to go into recession in 2016, ditto Russia, and of course, a big slowdown in China. You're looking at GDP growth this year projected between 6.5% to 7%. It's been growing at 10% for decades. That's been the norm for China. The new normal is something significantly below that. That has big implications for commodity exporters, people like Australia, Chile. They were sending all this stuff, copper and bauxite and all these things to China. China doesn't want them so much, but also means that Chinese demand for oil is massively down. And that's a big reason, well, not the major reason, but a big reason why oil is also scheduled to continue to go down. Its price has plummeted in recent months. RBS issued a report, I think, at the end of last year, beginning of this year, saying it could fall as low as $16 a barrel. That has huge implications for the geopolitics of the Middle East in particular, right? Because all the Gulf states, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they depend on this stuff, right? It's how they keep political grievances, antagonisms under control. That cradle to grave welfare state in Saudi Arabia, it does look after its people relatively well. It's a tyranny. It's not really got much of a rule of law. It's a despotism, but it does manage to look after most sections of society pretty well, right, by looking after them in terms of provision of public services. That was based on this powerful, huge petroleum exporting industry it had. That's under threat, right? $16 a barrel really undermines the ability of Saudi to do what it does and keep its people happy. That makes social conflict far more likely in 2016 in all these countries, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. It also will remake the geopolitics of these countries in so much as they have less money to throw around. There's a Saudi-led coalition. It's many of the Gulf states, but it's led by the Saudis, fighting Houthi-led rebels in Yemen. Some say they're being backed, funded, armed by the Iranians, although that's not really borne out by the facts. The Iranians have some involvement, precisely how much is unclear. Saudis are spending $200 million a day in Yemen, $6 billion a month. Last year they ran a deficit of $65 billion, something like that. So the Saudis are in big trouble. So this cocktail of threats it's twofold. Downturn in the global south, downturn in developing world economies, and also the geopolitics of oil are changing massively. So what does that all mean for Britain, right? Britain, to be fair, since 2008 it's grown pretty well. It's growing obviously faster than the Eurozone. It's growing faster than most of the major world economies, the G7 economies as we often call them. To what extent will it remain insulated from these headwinds? We don't know. We don't know. It's a deflationary crisis potentially transpiring on a global scale. The EU still doing terribly. What does it mean for Britain? We don't know. What we do know is that Britain's still running a big deficit, right? It's still running something like a £67 billion deficit this year. Remember that George Osborne promised to eliminate the deficit by this year in 2010. We're about halfway through, right? In addition to that, interest rates are at 0.5%. They've been there for 6-7 years. The talk was that they would go up this year, that they would go up probably towards the end of this year. The Bank of England 2 days ago voted 8-1 against to increase interest rates. Now people are saying that's going to be pushed forward to 2017. Why is that? Because to increase interest rates now, when these headwinds look as they do, this cocktail of threats is on the horizon, any increase in interest rates will draw demand out of the economy, right? People aren't going to be homeless because interest rates are raised 0.5%, but it would mean they'd be paying significantly more on their mortgages, right? That's money that then won't be spent on the rest of the economy, buying dinners, buying gifts, buying goods and services which keep up domestic demand. On the one hand, as interest rate rise, that may happen. If it did, given the global context, that's a problem. And then, of course, you've got cuts. And the worst thing you can have during a global downturn is cuts to public spending and an increase in interest rates, which would dampen demand. That would mean that a moderate crisis could become a bad one. But I don't think George Osborne said what he did because he's worried about economic insecurity, about a global crisis that could undermine the British economy. I think it's far simpler than that. I think his concerns are political, not economic. He was saying he'd done a great job, the Tories doing a great job, they were dealing with a deficit, rising wages, falling unemployment, stagnant productivity, but they don't talk about that because it's doing so badly, right? And now he's saying otherwise. Why change the tune? Well, I think that's because it's a response to the economy falling down voters' lists of priorities. People aren't looking at the economy and being scared anymore, quite frankly. And bear in mind, Blair, 97, Labour, won a huge majority. It wasn't because he had a big, shiny smile and did head-ups with Kevin Keegan. It's because voters weren't so worried about the economy. John Major government in 1997 actually ran the economy pretty well. They ran more surpluses than Thatcher did. Growth was pretty healthy, 4%, 2.5%, 2.6%, right? That meant that all of a sudden the terrain of politics moved from the economy, from wages, from growth, to public services, NHS waiting lists, school classroom sizes. And the worry for Osborne is if the same was to transpire between now and 2020, you may see a repeat. And all of a sudden the terrain moves from economic security, quote unquote, to the NHS, to housing, to moderately flatlining pay, to Trident. So this is, I think, a real early doors attempt at making sure that the narrative sticks to economics and it doesn't move to public services. If it does, Tory approval ratings are going to suffer a real hit. But this is a real tightrope for Osborne, right? Because the next 4 years he's got to convince the electorate that the economy is the most important thing, but it's also simultaneously not that important because it's being dealt with. It's in crisis, but it's also resolved. You can do that for 1 year, 2 years, you can't do it for 4 years, it's a long time. There's a tension there which I'm not sure how he can resolve. If the deficit's gone by 2020, I don't think it will be, but it'll be dramatically reduced probably, right? 30 billion a year, something like that. Unemployment stays low, let's say wages don't fall, yeah, the terrain will more likely be the NHS and housing. It certainly won't be what it was at the last general election or indeed in 2010. If there is a major crisis, however, and of course if Britain falls into recession, unemployment goes up, similar problems for Tories, right? Because they haven't then managed the economy in the way that they had. They've been in charge for 10 years and yet the problems remain the same. A deficit, an economy that doesn't work for most people, flat wages, and a recession could happen, right? So either way, it's a really tough message that Osborne has to nail here. And I think he's really trying to make his mind up, and giving a speech like he did about threats so early in 2016 means I think they know that they can't allow the debate to move on to public services. They can't move on to the terrains where Corbyn's really strong, particularly housing. So what do you think? You know what I think? I think this alleged cocktail of threats facing the UK economy is more about political expediency for George Osborne and creating an atmosphere of insecurity and fear than about communicating the truth. Why don't you put those thoughts down on the hashtag IMO Bastani, or reach out to me at Aaron Bastani or Novara Media, at Novara Media. It's a cold night tonight in London, but you know what? I'd always take a Tom Collins over a hot toddy. That's the authentic cocktail of fully automated luxury communism. Gin, lemon, ice, sugar. And don't you dare forget to put it in a high top glass. Bye.